Welcome to Compose Yourself, the podcast where academic writing meets self-discovery for the students at the Chicago School.
I'm Jason.
And I'm Cindy.
Whether you're crafting your first essay or refining your voice as a writer, we're here to guide you through the art of composition.
From brainstorming to final drafts, we'll break down the tools and techniques to help you think critically, write effectively, and express yourself with confidence.
So, grab a pen, open your mind, and
compose yourself. Welcome to Module 3. In this week's podcast, we're going to define a couple of terms around academic writing. We're going to dive into the rhetorical situation a little bit more and how learning about this is going to help our students in their whole academic journey. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the text that they're going to be engaging with in their rhetorical analysis. So first off, we just want to define a couple of terms, right? I mean, if you're going to talk about something really deeply, you should probably start by defining your terms. So
what does it mean?
One of the things we've been talking about that we really want to define this week is discourse community. So when I think of discourse community, I think of a group of people who share goals, they share a method of communication, they have a shared vocabulary, they have shared expectations and knowledge within a certain context. And this can apply to a broad range of things, right? They can be more serious things or they can be hobbies. So we talk about discourse communities because we're sort of entering a new one, which is the academic discourse community. But I think it's helpful to first think about maybe some different ones that you're already part of. So, Jason, thinking about your own life, what's a discourse community that you think, that you're part of? And can you kind of walk through those parts of the definition?
Sure. I've kind of mentioned it, but I enter into the college environment from K-12. I was there for about eight years. And so it's being an educator. And especially in K-12 where you're developing, these are developing minds, these are young children. They don't have the knowledge or vocabulary or experiences that, adults do in a college environment. We would have meetings with teachers, and in that environment, we would speak, they call it educationese, but we would use, very big terms or complicated words, or we would share knowledge like, oh, are you using PBL? And it's even an acronym, and everybody knew what that meant, and how that aligns. Like, is your PBL plan aligned with your CLOs? Well, now we need to get on to MTSS. And um, at first, that was really difficult for me to get into that environment. I even created a cheat sheet of all of these different acronyms and terms and what do they mean. But once you really become a part of that community and you become experienced with that community, you speak in that certain way, you have that shared knowledge. Um, but then you have to switch. Because obviously, then when I would go to my small reading groups and I'm working with a fifth grader, I'm not going to sit there and say, "Hey, I need you to reiterate what the CLOs are so that you can make sure that you're aligned with your PBL values." They're not going to understand that. So I think that juxtaposition, that difference, shows how being an educator alone, my job, my career, is a discourse community. We understood
Mhm.
each other.
Yes, and I think that most people can't connect with if they've had a job that at most jobs there's a discourse community, right, surrounding the kind of work that you're doing. I was thinking too about like the discourse community that of families. So like in my family, I have two adult daughters, and we sort of have our own discourse community because we will often talk to each other in, say, references from movies or TV that we watch together, or a song, song lyrics from a song that we listened to frequently, or something that we saw on a vacation. And we will say, use terms that have meaning to us, but to other people, they don't know what we're talking about because it doesn't necessarily relate to the words themselves. It's like the shared context and meaning that they had because we heard that song when we were driving in this certain place and this thing happened. And so all we have to do is say that song and we all know what we're talking about, right? So
Right.
It can be as simple as that. Like in your friend group or in your family, you have shared language because you have shared knowledge and experiences, and you use words in a way that makes sense to you in that context. So I think when people hear discourse community, they think that it has to be something really, scholarly and important, and really, it
Right,
doesn't.
right.
You can have a discourse community around a certain video game that you really love to play, that other people who play it also speak about it in a certain way. So I don't
Hmm?
want to overcomplicate the term because we all have discourse communities. And another term that can get to feel like it has to be really important is code switching. So this is something we're going to
Ooh.
talk about too as we look at readings, is this practice of alternating between languages that you know in different kinds of conversations. So I think that's something that I'm doing too when I talk to my kids in our sort of shared discourse is if I'm talking to someone else about the same situation, I might have to then explain. I wouldn't use the song lyric or a reference to, a character in a TV show to tell a person, to point out something to a person who, for them, that doesn't have any meaning. That's like speaking a different language. It doesn't mean
Right.
anything to them.
Right.
So I'm going to have to explain it in a different way. Something that I've noticed is that other people will sometimes do this when they know two languages and it's difficult for them to express the same idea in, say, English when they're talking to me. If it has something to do, if for them that has more meaning in their other code that they use. What are some situations where you've engaged in code switching in your life?
Hmm. I mean, building upon that last example I gave, we would do this frequently. We would have, co-teaching, small group activities, something like that. And you would just kind of instantly, you'd go up and speak to one of your coworkers, one of the other teachers. You're using that kind of complicated educationese, and then instantly you have to switch, and explain the concept or work with students, with young children.
Mhm.
And the funny thing I really want to point out with that is that we often think that communication is just words, but it's so much more than that. Even your body language, your tone. So, kind of getting
Mhm.
back to that idea of voice, even that changed. And it was still my authentic self when I would get my softer tone and I would say, okay, friends, well, today we're going to read this book and we're going to talk about A, B, and C. Um, that was still me, but that's code switching too. My body language, my tone, my affect and demeanor, all of
Mhm.
that changed because I had a new audience. I was code switching. What are some examples that you have?
Well, I think what's interesting about it is that when we talk about writing in an academic space, APA really demands that we do a little bit of code switching, right? Because in APA, let's say it has some rules surrounding how we're going to communicate in this discourse community of academic writing. So one of those things is person first language. So in APA, let's say you don't talk about, let's say you wouldn't say that person is autistic. You would say that person has been diagnosed with autism. So you want to make
Mhm.
sure that you're speaking in a way that's less casual. Like maybe you would say that person's autistic in a regular conversation and you don't mean anything by it. You're not trying not to think
Right.
about that person first. It's just how we talk maybe in more casual language. But APA centers the person. They also don't really allow for contractions. So like isn't, aren't. We wouldn't use those things. We would switch and say is not, which under other circumstances would feel really weird and we wouldn't do it.
It does, yeah.
Um, there are also weird rules in APA about capitalization, what's capitalized and what's not. And it can often feel very counterintuitive because in
Mhm.
other situations, we might capitalize something that isn't capitalized in APA. So we also try to remove things like figures of speech. Like, for instance, in APA, you wouldn't say things like the apple doesn't fall far from the tree or other figurative language. And the reason is you're assuming that the discourse community that you're writing to shares sort of these figures of speech that might be unique to our culture. So we don't want to be assuming that about a discourse community that everybody has these sort of figures of speech in their language. So it's important to just think about APA in terms of this is what we do in this discourse community. So the same way that you're talking about, you would switch your tone or the way that you're communicating, the words that you're using, depending on who you're talking to. When it comes to academic discourse, that's why we use APA. It has these sort of parameters, not just around how things are supposed to look on the page, but the ways that we communicate and sort of the discourse that we use. I think this is important because it really helps us respond to the rhetorical situation. So when you were talking about, I'm going to change my tone and I'm going to say, okay, today we're going to be reading this book and your like your tone of voice changes and maybe your body language is different and you're using different words. That's in response to your audience, right?
Absolutely.
So, and we know from this class that audience is part of the rhetorical situation. So, the rhetorical situation, when we say that, we're talking about purpose, audience, context, writer, topic, and sort of the interplay of all of these elements that come in when we're writing. So, can you think of some examples where you might use different language in response to those rhetorical situation elements?
Oh, absolutely. Like if I'm just trying to talk to my brother real fast, I'll send a text message, very informal language, very casual, maybe a meme, maybe some emojis. I might even condense words because I'm part of that generation where it was still cool to say BRB or LOL. But then if I call him up on the phone, I'm obviously not going to say, "Hey, that was so funny, LOL."
Right.
You kind of I start adapting because I realize that the context is different. Now I'm on the speaking on the phone versus texting on the phone. Um, but then at the same exact time, if I have to speak to maybe my grandparents, suddenly, even though the medium is the same, even though it's still all text messages, I change my demeanor. I change the words I use. I'm not going to use the maybe kind of controversial or risky meme because it's my grandparents. And I know that I cannot speak to them that way. So I think that example kind of shows that, even though some elements of the rhetorical situation might be similar, you need to take all of those things into account because if the audience changes or if the context changes, suddenly you are changing how you are communicating.
Right. I also think it's really important to think about purpose. So,
Yeah.
why are you having this communication, right? So, texts are funny because a lot of times, if you're just sending a text, you're trying to get something done, right? You need a response, or at least that's what
Right. Right.
my goal is. If I'm texting, I'm just trying to get more efficiently something done. I'm still of the generation that if I want to have a conversation with you, I'm probably going to call you on the phone and talk to you.
The audacity.
So
Oh no.
I know it sort of horrifies my kids, but I still do it. But I think that can be really helpful to think about in in the context of our class, thinking about things like discussion boards or our notebook assignments or the different kinds of writing that we're going to do. They all have different purposes, right? So, like a discussion board, the primary purpose is to communicate with your peers about a topic. So you might not be quite as formal, although we still have to use certain standards, like you need to use standard written English usually. You might need to cite in a discussion board so that you're still pointing back to source material. But generally, it's not quite as formal as you would be in, say, an assigned paper that you're going to turn in.
Right.
So every time you write, you are thinking about those elements of the rhetorical situation in order to write appropriately. I also think of this as
Absolutely.
like the ways that you have to write differently in social media platforms. So let's say if you're writing a post on X, you have to be aware of the constraint of how many characters you can use. So you're not going to write like a whole long thing. You have to stay in that whatever the word limit is or the character limit. And then if you're composing a post for say Instagram, the expectation is that there's going to be a picture, so you have to be thinking about,
Great.
okay, in this rhetorical situation, my audience expects a picture and then something related. I mean, we've all come across a post where we can't figure out why the picture is related to what the person wrote. And that feels odd, right? Because
Hmm?
in this discourse community, we have an expectation, and it is that the picture will be related to whatever it is that you
What
say.
I'm saying.
So the same things also apply to, let's say, when you're writing a resume or a cover letter or you go to an interview. The things that you say and the way that you communicate in those situations are going to be slightly different. But they're all in response to what's the purpose of this thing? Who's the audience? Who am I communicating with? What's the
Mhm.
topic that I'm communicating about? What identity am I enacting while I'm writing in this way? So all of those things sort of come into play when you're trying to be successful in a certain like communication situation.
And you know what's funny about that is that this is something I've noticed that we almost all have learned from a very, very young age, is that we know almost instinctively how to identify the rhetorical situation and the discourse community. We knew from a very, very young age that we are changing our language, we're adapting for depending upon the purpose or the audience or the context, and the discourse community. We know these things. We're just now putting words to them. We're defining them. We're kind of looking at the structure and how it works overall.
We're also applying it to a whole new situation. So when you come into college and you're sort of taking on this new academic identity in this discourse community of the college situation, you're going to run into lots of writing assignments where they don't necessarily point out, as we do in this
Oh,
class, who's the audience? Who should I assume the reader is? What's the situation I'm in? What's the purpose of this? They're not always going to tell you those things in your assignment prompts,
well,
say. So, what we're trying to help students do in this class is like really think about these things in the way that they are intuitive and then apply that knowledge to this new situation, which is when I go to my next class where I have to do a writing assignment and they don't tell me what's the purpose, who's the audience, the context, all of the expectations, can I sort of walk myself through that and think, okay, I know what the purpose is. I'm practicing writing a case study. I'm going to assume that my audience, isn't my instructor so that I make sure I tell them everything that I need to. Just thinking through all of those elements yourself is going to
right.
make you a stronger academic writer. The same way it makes you better at communicating with different groups of people, the way it makes you better at writing different posts for different platforms. You have to do that when you go into these writing situations in your academic life too. And it won't
Absolutely.
always be pointed out specifically. So, one way we're trying to give students the opportunity to practice this is we're giving them these texts to read, right, for their rhetorical analysis assignments. And we're giving them what we think are like really great texts because they have a clear voice and a clear audience and not clear as in it's directly stated necessarily, but if you're reading it for the rhetorical element, the rhetorical situation, you're going to be able to tell. So we're asking them to sort of pull these apart and look more deeply at these texts to dive into that rhetorical situation. What's going on behind the scenes? Um, so we're sort of not asking them to do this deep dive, right? We're not asking you to analyze it from like literature point of view, right?
Right, right, right.
We're asking them to do something else. What do you think about that? What do you think they should frame that as they're approaching these texts?
Well, I think first off, my advice is always number one, identify these elements. So see if you can figure out the purpose, the context, the audience, strategies used to appeal to ethos, pathos, logos, et cetera, et cetera. But then really with rhetorical analysis, you're evaluating it. And I think this is where students kind of get confused with a lot of
Yeah.
these assignments is they're expected to say, almost argue with the text, like, oh, I disagree or agree with this person.
Right.
And that doesn't really matter. It is, do you think this person achieved their purpose? Did they reach their audience? Did they respond to the context and rhetorical situation? Are these strategies effective? Um, so it's kind of a distancing you have to do. It's a different kind of writing and engagement. But I think that if you really stay focused upon the rhetorical situation, the discourse community of who these composers are writing or responding to, I think you'll be fine. Just don't try to, you're not arguing with the text.
Right.
What do you think?
I think that's so true. And I'm so glad you said that because often students will feel like what they're supposed to do is what they did in previous English classes, where you're like,
Hmm.
read this thing and then say what are they trying to do? Analyze the topic or whatever, agree with them or disagree with them. What we're really asking them to do is, like you said, does it work? What do you think they're up to? Why do you think they use the language that they used? What are they trying to accomplish and with who? And do you think it worked? And I think it's really important that they stay focused on that as they're engaging with these texts.
Absolutely.
So I hope this was helpful to our students as they're trying to engage with the texts in this course and analyze the rhetorical situations for these readings. And in the next episode, we're going to dive deeper into the rhetorical appeals by giving them what will probably be kind of a funny example of rhetorical appeals in advertising. So we'll see how that resonates with them in our next episode.
Sounds fun.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Compose Yourself.
Remember, writing is a process, and every word you write brings you closer to becoming the writer you want to be.
We hope you enjoyed today's discussion and that it makes clearer the topics you're exploring in this course. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to your instructor.
Until next time, keep thinking critically
And always compose yourself.